Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Andy Burnham's campaign for the Makerfield by-election is officially underway. Amazon UK's boss says young people are not to blame for youth unemployment. Is he right? Sadiq Khan goes head-to-head with Palantir. Silicon Valley going to war with London. And we end with a good news story about solar power. Often on a heat wave, we sort of talk about how the climate catastrophe is near and you should feel guilty while you're sunbathing. Today, we're going to talk about how actually, when it comes to solar power, we're in a pretty strong position. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Banseka Kayembe. Banseka, you are not dressed in London's uniform
over the
past
shocked.
2 days, which is, I thought you'd walked in an Arsenal shirt and you'd walked in a Liverpool shirt. But you had a good explanation for it earlier.
I did, yeah. Do you know what? Lots of people this week have finally come out of the woodwork saying they're Arsenal supporters. Never heard of that. Didn't even know they watch football. All of a sudden now they're winners, they're Arsenal supporters. So in the spirit of supporting your team, even when they lose, today I am repping Liverpool proudly.
That's very, very honourable. Admission on my part. On Wednesday, we started the show with the Arsenal fans celebrating because
I saw that.
I love collective joy. I even considered going on that night, even though that would have been sort of faking it, wouldn't it? That's like glory hunting.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
In the introduction, I proved how terrible a football fan I was and how opportunistic I was being by suggesting that the job at Downing Street was going from someone from North London to someone from Manchester, and the Premier League was coming down from Manchester to London. And then someone pointed out in the comments it was actually Liverpool that won it last year.
Yeah.
I thought it was Man City, so there I am.
Yikes.
I'm an embarrassment to myself. If you want to support people embarrassing themselves to thousands of people online, you might like to go to novaramedia.com/support and support the work we do. We've had a really, really exciting 2 weeks because we've had loads of new supporters, which we are so, so grateful for. If you've watched our fundraising video, we'll know we are moving into a new studio, which is very dear to my heart today because it's going to have air conditioning. Whereas today it's going to sort of gradually get more and more like a sauna in here. Not that that's really supposed to motivate your giving to keep me cool. Rather, it is to build an independent new media for a different politics. British politics is in flux. If you want a counterforce to the likes of GB News, who are trying to endlessly drag British politics to the right, then do consider going to novaramedia.com/support. We can't do this without you. Andy Burnham's Makerfield by-election campaign kicked off officially today, with the Manchester mayor putting forward his pitch for the constituency.
This is not business as usual. This is not more of the same. This is a change by-election. Politics in this country, British politics, is tired. It needs a new script. And over the next 4 weeks, the people of Makerfield are going to write that script. And it's great that they're going to get that chance. This by-election will force Westminster to focus on the places it usually looks past.
So it's a very interesting message when you were standing for the governing party, sort of an anti-politics, anti-Westminster message. Vote me to give the Prime Minister a kicking when the Prime Minister's in your party. Apparently, Keir Starmer is also going to be going to campaign for Andy Burnham in Makersfield. So I wonder how that will go down. Burnham did mention sort of some policy issues. He talked about the economy, about housing. Let's take a look at his pitch.
We want to get to a point when the Wigan Borough is building more council homes than it is losing through right to buy. It's still losing more than it's building. This borough, Greater Manchester, needs to hit the tipping point when we're building more than we're losing if we're going to solve the housing crisis. This country needs the biggest programme of council house building since the Second World War, but a new generation of council homes that are cheaper to rent and cheaper to run. So that is a real answer to the cost of living crisis that people are experiencing.
Now, if he was sort of, I suppose that's probably rhetoric, but if he was speaking in terms of an actual plan, the biggest council housing build programme since the Second World War Now, most of the council housing was built after the Second World War anyway, but there were years where more than like 200,000 council homes were built in a single year. That was actually under Harold Macmillan, a Tory Prime Minister. So let's hope he's, speaking seriously there. I'm not sure if he actually has sort of cashed out a plan to build quite so many council homes, but it's very exciting to hear a potential Prime Minister saying that. Because when you talk to people in local government, they say, why can't we build more council homes? It's because we don't have the money. They can't borrow like the central government can do. So if the central government could borrow billions to invest in council homes, you can tell the financial markets, yes, we're going to be spending more money, but we're going to get an asset at the end of it. That would seem to me a good use of central government power. Of course, Burnham is not just standing to be an MP, he's standing to become Prime Minister. And he made that clear by telling the crowds, a vote for me is a vote to change Labour. And he also appeared to unveil a campaign slogan.
I'm for us. I'm for us. I'm for people here. I'm for us, all of us, for these communities and these places. I'm in this campaign for us, fighting for everything that I've said today, everything that I believe in. I'm in the campaign. I'm fighting to win it with your support and with the support of the great people of this constituency, so that we can build a party and a country that is for us too. Thank you very much.
Quite explicit there. He wants to change the party, i.e. be leader of it. He wants to change the country, i.e. be Prime Minister. But it is all wrapped up with a pitch. I'm from the Northwest. I will represent people outside of Westminster. Should we take that argument seriously? Is it just a gimmick? Earlier today, I spoke to Louisa Munch. She's a Manchester-based academic and content creator. She has got just short of 300,000 followers on Instagram, where her video explainers on topics like neoliberalism, the far right, and dating culture frequently go viral. She's an interesting and increasingly influential voice on the British left. So I caught up with her to talk about the Makerfield by-election. And I started by asking Louisa about whether Burnham's focus on Manchesterism is meaningful or just a gimmick.
Well, to me, it's like localizing localization, basically. So, everybody knows like the yellow buses, and now everybody can travel around Manchester for £2, which has been something that has like a daily impact on people's lives, like an actual improvement. And that's all people want to see, is actual improvements on people's lives. People are not interested in economic growth on percentages and statistics that places like Westminster are giving us. We want to have actual material change to our lives. We want things to get cheaper. We want social housing. And what Andy Burnham has done is create those kind of moves in Manchester. And I think that's, why he is quite popular.
And to the extent that there is a Manchester model, there's been lots of debate sort of this week, obviously because everyone in London is now talking about Manchester because Andy Burnham's standing in this by-election, about what the Manchester model was. Was it state-led development? Was it actually sort of a fairly neoliberal property developer-led development with some public goods sort of along the way, such as the bus network? What's your sort of take on what's happened to Manchester, I suppose, in your lifetime?
Well, see, I'm from Rochdale, which is like a very impoverished area outside of Manchester. And this, it's not perfect, what Andy Burnham is sort of proposing, because obviously it does operate under neoliberalism. There is elements where, there isn't enough funding going into like social housing, and there are huge moves for like skyscrapers are going up and things like that. But in terms of like investments into local communities, I've seen Rochdale really change over the last probably decade, and we've lost a lot. Like there's so much anger out there. Like there's a load of flags flying outside my window right now, if you know what I mean. There is so much discontent, and as somebody who is from Rochdale, who's from the Northwest, there is this sense of hopelessness a lot of the time that I don't think places like London suburbs have. That we don't have this sense of, meritocracy that people actually believe in. And I think he has transformed Manchester city centre into this kind of hub. Obviously, it's like one of the fastest growing cities in Europe now. But there's always going to be issues where it's not enough. And I hope that what Andy Burnham does is, the sides of it where it is about localization, it is about moving these like transport and things like that into public hands. That's what he moves towards, and he has done a lot. And I think people do like him for that. But we always need to be saying and demanding what we need and what we want, and that needs to move towards like nationalisation and stuff.
You're a critical theorist. You're an academic. You're also an influencer. You've got 300,000 followers on Instagram, loads and loads of engagement. I imagine your audience is sort of very left-wing, very progressive, and very much leaning towards the Greens, I would assume. Do you think an Andy Burnham-led Labour Party is going to change that? Sort of how are you going to do your messaging? Because you've got to keep, your audience on side. It sounds like you're very much supporting Andy Burnham. I imagine that's not a sort of unified position among your followers. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with it in terms of saying something definitive on. We don't know what an Andy Burnham government will look like. I don't know how to, I can't predict that. I can say, look, this is about reform at the end of the day. As much as it is about Labour and the Greens and the left, we need to unify over the fact that if we don't, fascism is going to be on the rise in Britain. I do think the left needs to unify on this issue. And if we don't, we need to realise that the alternative is far worse than an Andy Burnham government, for example. And, I'm a member of the Greens, but in general, I just want to see change. I want to see things to get better for people and for normal people. And I don't know if the left totally realise how close we are to having a complete overtake of fascism in this country if we don't sort of come together and realise that, we need to come up with a sense of unity, basically.
And is that how you'd see a reform government? You think that would be fascism in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote my PhD on the rise of the far right, and all the indicators of fascism are there. And, we don't need to call it fascism if people feel uneasy about that term, but we need to understand that if we don't change socioeconomic systems, this is going to get worse. And, if reform get in, they're obviously going to fail on the economy. They're not going to improve conditions for people. And then the left need to be there to offer an alternative. There needs to be an alternative. And if Andy Burnham is that alternative, which I hope he is, then that's what we need to back. And I can't predict the future. I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but we have to have hope. And it seems Andy Burnham does have a vision. And he said, okay, we need to rewrite the script of what's going on. And that sounds good to me.
That was Louisa Munch speaking to me earlier today. Of course, while Burnham's campaign in Makerfield got off to a fairly smooth start, the Green Party haven't been so lucky, with a projected vote share of around 10% in the upcoming by-election and tight polling between Labour and Reform. Even with Burnham on the ticket, the Greens were entering a race in a relatively strong position. But within hours of being announced as the Green Party candidate in the by-election, Chris Kennedy suddenly withdrew from the race. So a Green Party spokesperson cited personal and family reasons to explain the sudden turnaround, with the party wishing him all the best. But yesterday evening, it became clear there was a bit more to it than that. So it emerged that Kennedy had shared posts online that described the arson attack in late March on ambulances in Golders Green as a false flag, so sort of suggesting it was a staged event. The Times reports this as one of the posts shared, explicitly calling the ambulance attack a false flag. Kennedy also shared another post written by self-proclaimed proud ethno-nationalist Hugh Anthony, who said this: How does someone manage to burn 3 ambulances, get the entire country in uproar, make the government put 264 more police units into the community, make the king become a patron of a charity, and increase the terror threat level in the UK, only to be put on bail? This makes no sense. That's by Hugh Anthony. Self-proclaimed proud ethno-nationalist Hugh Anthony. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking questions. I think that he did share a graphic which made it seem as if it was confirmed this was a false flag, and there is no evidence that it was a false flag. I mean, if someone asks a question, I think that's fine. But if you want to be a politician, then sharing that it was a false flag when it wasn't is not great. Banseka, any thoughts on either, I suppose, the Green Party situation or the Andy Burnham by-election? From speaking earlier, I know your mood has changed somewhat since last Friday.
A week is a long time in politics, they say, and that definitely seems to be the case. I mean, just to take the Green Party thing really quickly. I mean, I do think it is worth saying, like, I don't really think it was a great idea for him to share the very definitive post that said quite definitively this was a false flag operation, or that was I think that's what you can glean from that Instagram post or screenshot that you just shared. I know there've been some contentious conversations online today about this. Ultimately, I think the Green Party should have high standards. You know, some have compared Reform, who have said nothing about the really ugly tweets allegedly that their candidate for Makerfield has a history of posting, some of which are quite disturbing and conspiratorial. Reform have said nothing really about that and just kind of carried on as normal. I don't want the Green Party to be like that. I want the Green Party to have higher standards. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the Reform candidates' posts were, the same or synonymous as this Green Party candidates. I think the Reform guys are, much, much worse, far more conspiratorial. But yeah, I know the left can be sensitive about this because of the very long history of weaponization of anti-Semitism, but we can't allow that to mean that we always buckle. And we always say, no, we can never apologise. We can never say, oops, I shouldn't have done that. Ultimately, there is anti-Semitism or there is anti-Semitic, issues across the political spectrum, potentially. We are all liable to fall potentially for conspiratorial, theories about Jewish people, because it's an issue that is writ large across society. And I think when the Green Party get that wrong, that it's good for them to apologise and say that. I'm not suggesting that he should have definitely pulled out of the race. He probably could have apologised and carried on had he wanted to, but perhaps he felt on a personal level like he couldn't, and I respect that, but I'm not really prepared to sit here and say that I think what he posted was completely fine. Got to be very careful, and I suppose we know this as journalists as well. You don't really want to be saying anything definitively before you've actually got the evidence to say so, unfortunately.
Especially about such a sensitive topic.
Yes, rather, yeah. We don't want to inflame tensions further. We don't want to do the job of continuing to deepen those divides that are stopping us from resolving a lot of the issues we care about on the left, right?
And Burnham?
Yeah, I mean,
you're down on Burnham this week.
Well, I mean, I don't think I was ever fully up. Just to clarify, I said he would do a bit of Keynesianism. I think is what I was talking about last week. And
you've got hundreds of thousands of council homes there potentially,
and that's quite exciting. Don't get me wrong.
I think that was just rhetoric.
That's the idea that
everyone says since the Second World War, just to make what they're saying sound more dramatic. And I think actually, I looked at it was 250,000 council homes were built in 1953. I mean, there's no reason why we can't do that now.
Yeah,
I suppose a lot of the houses have been bombed then, but we're not poorer than we were then. We should be able to have a super ambitious council house building program, but I'm not quite sure who's committing to that. Anyway, I interrupted you. Sorry.
That's all right.
Explain your shift.
Yeah, so I mean, some of that stuff on the economics sounds decent. I've got some skepticisms about how far he's going to go renationalisation. I know your guest, Louisa, was talking about wanting things to move towards a renationalisation kind of vibe. Josh Simons was on Laura Kuenssberg, I think, at the weekend, where they were talking about the prospect of water nationalisation. There's lots of issues, isn't there, with private water companies. He definitively said no. He was like, no, that's not going to happen. We don't know how true that is, of course. I don't know what his sway will be in a potential Burnham government. There were rumours that he might get a job, Josh Simons, in number 10 as a reward for having given up his seat. And I'm very cautious or quite worried about those kind of same Labour right people being involved in what is supposed to be, as Andy Burnham said in that clip, change. Okay, can you change the old guard? Can we not maybe have more of the same people tinkering on in the background as well? Also slightly worried about some of his stances around immigration, saying that he's tantamount to, wanting to support Shabana Mahmood, who, is getting rid of migrants apparently very efficiently, if we're to look at the latest statistics. That worries me. That combination of, yes, there might be a bit more state interventionism but some of the other stuff around it isn't really going to change. Gives me a pause.
We'll keep talking about Andy Burnham, won't we, until the by-election, but we won't dwell for too long today. When it comes to jobs, the kids are not okay. That's according to a recent report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. According to its research, a recent fall in youth employment is looking pretty similar to declines we last saw during the COVID lockdowns and the 2008 financial crisis. Young people are defined here as those aged between 16 and 24. Among them, the unemployment rate now stands at over 16%, the highest it's been since 2014. The unemployment rate for the working age population as a whole is just 5%. Let's look at some of these figures. So this graph shows the share of 16 to 24-year-olds in employment according to two different measures. Essentially, they show the same pattern. Following a period of stability, youth unemployment fell rapidly by almost 7% during COVID, but recovered quickly afterwards. However, since 2022, that share has fallen again, more gradually, but also more consistently, with a more than 4% drop last year. Now, that kind of pattern is actually more worrying than a sudden drop, because when you've got a sudden drop due to sort of something external happening, a pandemic, a financial crisis, you think probably when the crisis is over, it will come back up again. However, if youth unemployment is trending downward, sort of just consistently with no end in sight, that's not good. So what's going on? Well, we hear a lot about an increase in young people applying for disability-related benefits, usually due to mental health. Now, that's undoubtedly a very real phenomenon. And the share of 16 to 24-year-olds out of work or education reporting a work-limiting condition is up 70% in the last decade. But it can't just be a case of people preferring a life on benefits, as parts of the right-wing media would have you believe. The IFS showed that the group with the biggest drop in employment between 2022 and 2025 are those aged 16 and 17, who saw a 6% and 8% drop in employment, respectively. And that group isn't actually entitled to means-tested benefits. The IFS says this isn't just down to more being in education. So what's going on? Well, the report cites mental health, minimum wage rises, and hikes to employer national insurance. But technology is also cited as a big factor, and young people looking for work have found a surprising new ally, at least in rhetoric. I'm not sure how genuine we should take this to be. John Bumfrey, fantastic name, head of Amazon UK, appeared on a recent episode of the BBC's Big Boss podcast.
I think too often you read about young people that somehow they lack motivation, they lack resilience, they lack the will to develop skills. That is not our experience. We have to stop blaming young people. It's not a motivation problem, it's a system problem, and that requires a system response. So what I mean by that is, our system isn't necessarily producing young people who are ready for work. And the most transformative thing that I've seen that helps young people is work experience. It could just be a week. If you get a T-level student and they come in for a week, they understand the value of teamwork, of communication, of problem solving, things that I don't think we teach in our curriculum, but that all employers are looking for.
Now, obviously everything he says is correct, but when sort of someone is putting forward the answer to our problems is to get young people to do work experience, I can't think of anything other than having them sit in the passenger seat and piss in a plastic bottle, because that's what Amazon delivery drivers sometimes have to do, because his company works them to that extent. There have been reports of people in Amazon warehouses sort of having to go to hospital when they're pregnant because they weren't allowed breaks. So I'm not sure, an afternoon in an Amazon warehouse is going to start making young people more keen to enter the workforce. But anyway, the words were fine. Technology might be taking jobs, I suppose, by sort of removing some lower level administrative positions. But it may also be making the job application process more demoralizing. Many young people report becoming discouraged by potential employers ghosting them, and application processes bogged down by applications pumped out by AI. So if you're a business just getting so many applications, you can't read them all. AI has also been playing another role. This one's worse, with nearly half of job seekers reporting in a recent survey that they've been subject to AI interviews, which were described as awkward and humiliating, with many rejected without ever having a human being look at their application. Now, one person, 21-year-old Thomas, told The Guardian this: "Most companies do faceless interviews where you are given a pre-recorded video of someone asking a question, followed by up to 2 minutes to plan a response, followed by 3 minutes to give your answer. These are the worst of the free tests, as it feels strange talking into a camera, and it can be difficult to speak naturally. You can't see anyone other than yourself. It doesn't feel real. It's like you're looking into a mirror and speaking to yourself. There's no human interaction. If you had an in-person interview, you'd be able to see how someone's reacting and that they're acknowledging what you say. God. No, I never had to do one of those. I remember that sort of like, obviously I look into a camera for a living and now I find it very normal. But I remember the first time I had to do this, how weird it was, just like looking into a camera and talking sort of kind of to yourself, even though you know that someone else is going to watch it. I mean, this is bad. I mean, I think especially like young, recent graduates or someone who hasn't gone to university, like applying for jobs at the moment, anecdotally, does sound like a miserable experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think me and you are a similar-ish age, right? And I felt like it was pretty bad maybe when we were leaving uni.
I just assumed you were younger. How old are you?
I'm 33.
I'm 35 or 36.
Yeah, so
I'm the age
like...
where you can never quite remember which one it is.
Post 35.
I think I'm 35.
You know, and I remember having a tough time. It took me quite a long period of time before I got my first quote-unquote official graduate job. I did a long stint in hospitality, actually. But, you know, it was bad then, and I think it's really, really bad now. I mean, it was interesting that the Amazon guy basically frames it as a skills issue. Says, well, actually, like, you know, young people just need a bit more work experience. They need a bit more experience in the real world. And there's something to that about the way in which perhaps the academic world does not prepare you for the world of work, because they're two very different things. But that's not going to resolve these extremely structural issues. He referred to it as a structural issue and then pointed out something that I think was not going to help really any young person pretty much at all. You know, I think if you've got structural issues where young people's sort of entry-level jobs, graduate-level jobs are actually just being replaced largely by AI, like you can have all the new skills in the world, you're not going to be viewed as efficient as a piece of AI technology. I also think this is an underlooked thing as well, but AI is not only potentially bad for the people whose jobs get replaced, so young people, entry-level job people, but it's also a bit rubbish for the people who then have to start working with an AI robot instead of a human.
Well, sometimes they're better.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not in a customer service sense, because they can't. Because in customer service, nearly what you always need to do is say, can you make some kind of exception? I know this is not in your sort of explicit terms and conditions, but can you make an exception? And you obviously need a human to do that. So normally, customer service, you always want to get through to the human, actually.
Yes.
But I mean, there are loads of elements of the work process which are sort of improved by technology.
Yeah.
And make it more productive. But no, I mean, I generally agree with you.
I don't want to do that Luddite thing, because I think it's very easy on the left to sound like a Luddite and sound like you hate technology. But I suppose it's about thinking about who benefits the most from AI tech, right? There could be a world, a people's owned AI. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later.
Do you think partly youth unemployment is because phones have de-skilled us all and made us all a bit less socially competent?
No.
No?
I don't think so. So you think people lack sort of people skills or emotional skills? Yeah. I mean, maybe.
I think smartphones are an emotionally and intellectually dysregulating device, especially if you've sort of never not had one.
I mean, there maybe is something to that, because there is this twinning, right, of on the one hand, the sort of austerity that got brought in post-2010, which kind of cleared out, you know, state infrastructure. And in the vacuum of that, you start to get, you know, the proliferation of private companies instead, including social media apps, you know, which young people, you know, spend a lot of time on. So whilst we have dismantled things like youth centres, for example, and real life places where young people could have built some of those skills, you know, to have, you know, emotional skills and all those types of things, people skills, communication skills, that's been replaced by, you know, spending copious amounts of time on social media. So maybe that is part of that kind of replacement of the state and of public spaces by private spaces, which have then maybe de-skilled people.
Yeah, it's difficult to know, isn't it? Because of the youth centres, obviously, the government did close them down just before smartphones came in. Yes. But with like gay clubs, austerity obviously didn't, I mean, rents went up, but austerity didn't really apply to gay clubs. But Grindr killed a lot of them. So I wonder if social media would have killed the youth clubs even without the austerity.
Yeah.
Difficult to know.
It's impossible.
I mean, we shouldn't have gone ahead and closed them just preemptively anyway. That was a bad move.
Yeah, you're not pro closing.
We can agree, keep the youth clubs open. If anything, and ban the phone. Don't let the phone in. Sadiq Khan is feeling the wrath of Silicon Valley after blocking a procurement deal between Palantir and the Metropolitan Police. the Met Police had agreed a deal worth £50 million to use Palantir's technology in criminal investigations. But it's been blocked by the Mayor's office over apparent breaches to procurement rules. So the Deputy Mayor for Policing said the Met had only seriously considered or engaged with Palantir as potential supplier of these services and hadn't properly tested whether their services were value for money. So a fairly sort of bureaucratic, formal reason. It's this comment, though, from the Mayor's spokesperson that has provoked the most attention. So they said, the Mayor expects that Londoners would only want to see public funding go to companies that share the values of our city. So the decision by the Mayor's office and that explanation for it have prompted a furious response from Louis Mosley, who is CEO of Palantir UK.
Well, I think the Mayor is putting politics over public safety. He talks about values, but I think what Londoners value is not being mugged, not being raped by a serving police officer. And that's really what the focus here should be.
I suppose on the counter to that, this is democracy in action. He's been elected by millions of people. He doesn't have to do business with you. You don't have an inherent right to be a part of the Met Police's software procurement and the technology that they use.
But this comes back to then the rule of law. That is not in the rules. And if we're going to politicise procurement in that way, then we are going to compromise public safety. I'll give you another example. Tim Martin, founder of JD Wetherspoons, famously pro-Brexit. The Mayor, famously anti-Brexit. Arguably, the majority of London's anti-Brexit. Does the Mayor want to ban Wetherspoons from London?
That would involve closing a lot of pubs.
I think, we're going to look at another bit of Louis Mosley in a minute, but I just wanted to cut in there because the problem with that example is any Londoner can choose not to go into Wetherspoons. Right? Whether or not there is a Wetherspoons. If I am sort of incredibly personally affronted by Tim Martin, I can just not go to Wetherspoons. It's not going to be the case that as a Londoner, if Palantir get this deal with the police, that I can say, you're not allowed to find me with your Palantir software. Not that they'd have any reason to find me. But you can't opt out of it, basically. Also, I think it just goes without saying that Palantir is much more critical infrastructure. The police's IT system is a much more critical infrastructure than pubs. And therefore, sort of the political sensitivity of it and the leverage. Because the important thing here is that if you control something which the police rely on, or the military, we take this for granted when it's the military, but I think it's the same with the police. And the same with the NHS, really. If that service becomes reliant on a private company, then that gives that private company an enormous amount of leverage in a way that opening a bunch of pubs does not give Tim Martin. Let's look at the rest of that clip of Louis Mosley.
Why is that directed at Palantir?
I think that's a question you need to ask the Mayor. Why does he take exception with our values and not with other tech companies? Why, for example, is it that we may work in Israel, but so does Amazon, so does Microsoft. We may work with the Trump administration supporting the immigration enforcement arm of his government. So does Amazon, so does Microsoft, so does every other tech supplier you can think of. Why do we get singled out? It's a very good question, and I would welcome you putting it to him.
So Mosley is right that Palantir is not alone as a tech company working with Israel or ICE. It has, though, done these things with particular gusto.
I'm very happy to have you along for the journey, and you are partners for us. Every Palantirian, we are crushing it. Everyone else who's listening, we are dedicating our company. We have dedicated our company to the service of the West and the United States of America, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. And we love our success in the U.S. and globally. Also, we are doing in the United Kingdom and many other places. Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them.
That was Palantir CEO Alex Karp speaking on an earnings call in 2024. Now, as part of its commitment to defending the West, which Karp argues should be more proud of its superiority over other cultures, Palantir has tied itself incredibly closely to Israel. So in October 2023, the company took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying Palantir stands with Israel. And Palantir also held a board meeting in Tel Aviv to show their full-throated support for the country. More meaningfully, more significantly, its technology has been used extensively in quote-unquote war-related missions. including identifying targets during Israel's genocide. Palantir is also at the forefront of the development of autonomous weapons, which many AI safety experts think could have catastrophic impacts. Catastrophic impacts, though, are something their co-founder Peter Thiel hasn't always seemed too fussed about.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit
Should
in this.
the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also would I also would like us to radically solve these problems.
It's tense there. For a moment, I thought we were going to give control of the NHS and the police force to someone who doesn't want humanity to survive. But thankfully, reassuringly, after 20 seconds of humming and ahhing, he did finally confirm he does want humanity to prevail. He also said he wants problems to be solved. So the problems sort of in the rest of that interview, very interesting interview, by the way, included whether or not Greta Thunberg, who he refers to as the Antichrist, will bring about a one world government, and whether we can achieve radical life extension. I've got nothing against radical life extension, but I think the problem with many of these Silicon Valley people is they're sort of willing to risk everything so that they personally can upload their sort of minds to a computer and live forever, whether or not they have any democratic consent for these wild transformations they are suggesting they impose on society. The Metropolitan Police, for their part, still want access to Palantir's technology. So in response to Khan's veto, a spokesperson for the force said this: "The technology we want to introduce is crucial to maintaining our service to London while shrinking for the third consecutive year. Failing to introduce new technology to address back office processes and build our effectiveness is the opposite of value for money. The technology has shown it can save much more than it costs and that it can improve performance. Without new technology delivered at pace, we will be forced to make further tough choices that cannot avoid reducing officer numbers, affecting our service to London and our ability to keep the capital safe." Palantir recently carried out work with the Met to identify police corruption and misconduct, including hundreds of officers across the force who had broken internal rules, who were under investigation for criminal offences. So I think the Met said they hope that this would increase confidence in the police. Obviously, the deal with Palantir means that has somewhat backfired. Banseka, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it feels, the way it's couched by that Met sort of statement, it makes it sound quite existential to basically say Londoners are going to be less safe if we don't do this, which I imagine is something that lots of people will respond to. And whilst I've obviously got my own skepticisms about, policing and how policing operates and whether it really makes people safe or not, it is kind of a continuation of sort of what we were talking about before, really, which is the ways in which austerity have created these gaps. And then platform capitalism has been able to kind of fill in its place. And the statements made by some of the individuals are not really, they're highly ideological, aren't they? They really are quite sort of highly ideological. And so I think there is a public interest. I think fairness on Sadiq Khan's part, good for him. I think that he's put a halt to this. And you're completely right about that lack of consumer choice. An absurd comparison to say it's the same as, deciding what pub you go into. I had an appointment at the NHS several months ago and they were using AI to capture our whole conversation. And I had no choice. No one even told me before I got in there that, AI was going to be used. And I tried to ask questions like, where's my data going to be stored? But it wasn't really answered. What am I going to do? Go private? So you've got no choice, I think, once the state chooses to give out these contracts to these AI tech firms that are privately owned. I think it's interesting as well. It's worth remembering Palantir have a lot of state funding, right? It's something around 55%. So they've couched themselves in terms of defending sort of Western values, which no doubt presumably includes a kind of rugged form of capitalism. And yet they are mostly state funded. They're mostly getting state contracts to do their work. I don't think they would exist, maybe certainly not as proliferately as they do, but without it. So there's all these contradictions are kind of riddled and involved in this. But honestly, good for Sadiq Khan for that pushback.
Yeah, I suppose he thinks he's sort of tacking left, and maybe it will, if he wants to stand again. Obviously the Greens are going to be the biggest threat at the next election. So he might think that this is I suppose, parking his tanks on their lawn. I think he's probably done the right thing here. I do think it is very plausible to me that Palantir probably can do it better than anyone else for the NHS as well. Like, because these organizations don't have the in-house capacity to build a really effective system. I mean, obviously, especially for the NHS, it sounds like their in-house IT system isn't very good. I can see why a manager in the NHS, for perfectly honest, reasonable reasons, would say, we want to get the best system, and the best system is Palantir. Now, obviously, I'm not in a position to I can't write you a review of all the different patient data organization systems, but it seems perfectly plausible to me that they would be the most effective one. But then the question is, does that make sense as a long-term strategy?
Yeah.
And I mean, me and Aaron were talking on Wednesday or Tuesday, I'm not sure which day, about HS2 and saying the big problem with HS2 is that the state has lost all capacity to run its own engineering project. And therefore that means that one, we can't control costs when we need it. We're way behind. You end up sort of relying on companies over which you have very little control. And this feels like one of those hinge moments, right? Where we could say, yes, we are going to need AI to do this integration. And the quickest way to get the best system is to buy in Palantir now. Or would it make more sense to say, okay, let's take our time. Let's say we've got 5 to 10 years to do this. And in that 5 to 10 years, we're going to build up the domestic capacity to have a homegrown, or maybe a European-based, maybe it doesn't have to be British, but you could say like maybe the EU could get together and say, instead of doing what we did before with Google and Facebook and everything, which is just rely on the American tech stack, let's invest in sort of our own companies and our own tech stack. And yes, it might take a bit longer, but this is technology which we're going to have for the next 50, 100 years maybe. So maybe we don't want to jump straight into bed with an American company that, I mean, Palantir is very clear. They do work for the American government in the sense that sort of the CIA had a big part in their founding. And, if Trump gets into a big conflict with Britain and sort of demands that Palantir do X, Y, Z, like, are they going to stick up for their British customers? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. And I think it's, there's kind of a sovereignty angle really ultimately to this, isn't it? We've had conversations about sovereignty since Brexit. Whatever you think about whether you vote to leave or remain, there are serious questions to answer about who owns Britain, who owns this country. Do people here who vote own this country and decide what happens, or is it all decided in Silicon Valley? My concern, I suppose, is once Palantir gets in, which it already has, it's already in our infrastructure anyway. How easy are they to remove?
Yeah.
If we're talking about, well, we do this in the short term, but in the long term, we're building up capacity to be able to do this on our own. I think we should. Goes back to some of the arguments we were talking about before with lack of jobs for young people. The jobs aren't really there. The state, I think, needs to do more to create those jobs. Why not create those jobs in something exciting like AI and AI for the people? But I don't know how easy it would be to remove Palantir if they were kind of there for the short to medium term whilst we build the capacity. Unfortunately, in this respect, we're not like China. China's got, they've got their China dream till, 2049, 2050.
I think it goes on forever, the China dream.
It's indefinite. Oh, okay. It's just very, very exciting. I can feel
the worst thing some deadlines. I'm being disingenuous.
Well, the deadlines move, I think, quite a bit, don't they? But, they're...
Well, they meet their deadlines. They're much better at deadlines than we are.
Yeah. I mean, so they've got the capability. I find myself quite jealous of the capability that they've got to do this really long-term planning that, we can't even build HS2. So there are some really, really big choices to make here, right, economically, about what we invest in and where. And I do think that these firms like Palantir, to me, they are vultures. I feel like they are vultures picking on the carcass of the sort of British state, really. And I'm worried that if we let them in too much, that it's actually going to be very difficult to get rid of them.
I mean, it's very similar in a way, actually, to the EU argument, because the Brexit argument, they always said, look, we know that leaving the EU might in the short term come with a hit. And it might make life more difficult because we're going to have to start taking responsibility for our own, borders is what they would say. But, those ways where we'd outsource decisions to the EU, we're going to have to make those ourselves. And even, the smart people in favor of Brexit all admitted, yes, there will be a short-term hit, but for long-term sovereignty, it's worth it. And you very rarely hear those same people saying the same thing about tech, right? Because I think that our reliance on American tech is probably, in the long term, a bigger inhibitor of our sovereignty than membership of the European Union. Right? Because membership of the European Union was much more transparent. You might find it bureaucratic or whatever, but we did get input into how it was run. There were lots of veto points. there aren't in Silicon Valley. They can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
So we have made ourselves completely reliant on a small amount of Silicon Valley-based tech firms over which we have no control. But all the people who found sort of some people in Europe, some bureaucrats in Europe who ultimately we helped appoint, them having a bit of control over a few rules and regulations, like that was an affront to sovereignty so powerful we had to leave and sort of risk slower growth for 10 years. But Palantir, we have to jump into bed with them immediately.
Yeah, and no kind of crickets from the right on on any of that. They've not got any solutions around that either. I mean, selling people the kind of short-term pain for long-term, it's not an easy pill to swallow, is it? And people have heard that now. The problem is for 14 years because the Conservatives told us that with austerity, a little bit of pain, but there'll be long-term gain. We're still waiting for the long-term gain, aren't we? So I don't know. I'm not an expert in this. I don't know if there are things that we can do to lessen that pain. I wouldn't be particularly amenable to sell. People have had enough pain. We need to give people some hope. We need to give people some joy. We need to give people some excitement, and telling people there's more pain to come in all for sovereignty, which is this kind of ethereal concept.
Yeah, but you can phrase it in an exciting way, right? Which is we're going to build this incredible, amazing homegrown tech scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
With a little dose of like anti-Yank nationalism. Just a little dose, a safe amount, a little drop. When a heat wave hits the UK, we often talk about the urgent need for climate action and how governments aren't doing enough. That, of course, remains true. But I thought I'd focus on a more positive side of sunny days today, which is that solar power is absolutely booming. Globally, the amount of energy produced by solar increased by 30% last year, 30% in 1 year. That's incredible. And this is not an outlier for the technology. So the amount of electricity generated by solar has jumped on average 27% every year for a full decade. Solar power has now overtaken wind and nuclear, or almost nuclear, it's now sort of matching in terms of energy generation. And this increase was enough to meet the entire growth of electricity demand, meaning for the first time outside of global recessions, fossil fuel use for electricity production fell. It's fantastic. Now, of course, if you are a regular viewer of this show, you won't be surprised to learn this transition is mainly being driven in one country, China. This chart shows how much solar capacity has been added to the global grid each year since 2022. As you can see, it's going up every year. The dark green shows solar capacity added in China. The light green shows solar capacity added everywhere else. Now, as you can see, for the past 3 years, the dark green block fills up most of the bar. So China has installed more solar capacity in each of the past 3 years than the rest of the world combined, which is incredible. Very, very important. Before you say, but China is also burning loads of coal. Yes, they are, but they're moving in the right direction. So China's exponential growth over the past 4 decades was powered by coal and other fossil fuels. This line shows that rise continuing in the last 10 years. However, since 2023, so you see it's constantly going up, so they were using more and more fossil fuels over this period of time. Since 2023, for the first time ever, the amount of electricity generated by fossil fuels in China has flatlined. So China's carbon emissions have peaked. Still very high, but they've peaked. And this is the key bit. That's not because China's energy production has stopped growing. That's still going up. So you want that, especially if you've still got a lot of poor people. You want your energy to grow. You want more electricity. But what's happening in China is that extra electricity is coming from solar. And that's a story that now applies on a global level. So this chart shows the cumulative change in electricity demand globally from the year 2000. As you can see, it's always going up fairly linearly, actually. It's a sort of straight line. That's good. We want more people to have access to electricity. That's a major sign of development. Great. Line goes up is good. However, until 2024, more electricity meant more fossil fuel use. But, and this is the good news, for the first time last year, all the extra demand was met by renewables, mostly wind and solar. So then the amount of electricity used still going up, but the amount of fossil fuels used to create electricity is now level. Of course, another problem you might have now, none of this solves solar's big problem, which is intermittency. So solar might be good as part of an energy system with nuclear, gas, or coal as its base load, so it's backup. You need that in case the sun isn't shining, for example, at night. So often in energy systems at the moment, solar will sort of put money into the grid in the day, and then at night it will be a gas turbine that powers the electricity grid, which is a big problem for solar. However, there's also good news on that front. So the Financial Times has run an article on the dawn of 24/7 solar power. They say this dawn has been driven by falling battery costs. The article cites Bloomberg research showing the cost of utility-scale batteries has more than halved since 2022. That's in 3 years, it has halved. That's incredible. With 24-hour solar plants now being built in Abu Dhabi, Australia, and even India. These are countries with lots of sun. The caveat is that if the sun doesn't come out for like a few days, then you will need more batteries than is plausible. So we probably, in a country like our own, we will still need a different source of baseload power. But the big problem with solar was always batteries being quite expensive. Batteries are now cheap. Banseka, can people enjoy the sun this weekend without feeling a nagging sense of impending doom?
I think so. I think this is a good story, I think, isn't it? There's a lot of doom and gloom, obviously, that often accompanies sort of climate change stories, which from a behavioural change perspective can make people just shut off, can't they? But this is a good news story. I was quite happy to read it when I saw the script today. I think it's interesting to see that some of these key technologies are now going to become perhaps more economically competitive. So there's a kind of good economic argument for that as well. Decarbonisation is not something kind of hypothetical. It's something that that is possible. And perhaps it's a sign that the energy system is beginning to change in some aspects structurally. Don't want to be complacent about that, because of course there are lots of vested interests in keeping things exactly the way that they are. There's lots of vested interests, of course, still in fossil fuels and oil and all of that stuff as well. But it's good to see that economically some of these things actually are quite viable. The China example is really interesting as well, isn't it? China contains multitudes. On the one hand, it's still emitting a lot, but it's also leading the charge for green energy, which is really interesting. Strikes me that's a talking point really for stronger industrial policy. I'm assuming that's how they've done it, right? The ability to be able to do that really large scale, long-term planning that I said I was envious of earlier in the previous section. Green technology is part of that China dream, I guess, right? Which is really interesting. So things like coordinated investment, subsidized production, accepting sort of perhaps lower short-term profitability for longer-term profitability in the long run once this becomes more and more profitable, is really exciting. And, for energy to be treated, I suppose, energy transition, to be treated as a national strategic priority, which it looks like the Chinese government is doing, the CCP is doing, is very exciting. It's a bit of a, what would you call it? They're sort of leading the way in that respect, despite the negative things that we often hear about China being the worst emitter. They are leading a pathway perhaps for something a bit different. Whether we can do that here, there's many different things. The way the Chinese economy works, you know that better than me, of course, having been there yourself recently.
I'm an expert. I've been there for 2 weeks.
Well, you had a good chat with Jostein Hager and people like that as well, haven't you? And so I'm sure there's huge structural differences between the way their economy works and ours. I don't know if you've got any ideas about to what extent we can actually learn from in terms of green technology.
Well, it's worse. Our emissions are now lower than China. Yeah. So we have done quite well. Like we have halved our emissions. So
is that like per? How is that measured, by the way? Like because obviously we're much smaller.
Per capita. So our emissions have halved per capita. China's have just leveled off. But obviously the example that China gives to the world is one that you can have extraordinarily fast development while using an expanding number of renewables. Because obviously, it's difficult for like a sub-Saharan African country or India to sort of take inspiration from Britain because we already developed and actually now we're stagnating. So there's an argument that, our route to carbon neutrality hasn't been very attractive for other countries to follow because electricity did get more expensive and we're actually using less electricity every year. Whereas China is showing that you can have super fast development, you can have a consistent increase in the quality of life, all while going green. So I think there probably are more, even though we've done a decent job at reducing carbon emissions, like halving them in 20 years, not too shabby. I think there's probably fewer countries looking at Britain and saying, I want to be like Britain. And there are lots of countries looking at China and thinking, I want to be like China. Also, obviously, we don't export really cheap solar panels to the rest of the world, and China does. So there is a big sense in which China is enabling the green transition just in a way more significant way than anyone else in the world.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel like, even though we've done a good job with some aspects of the emission stuff, it doesn't feel like it's a part of our economy. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know what our economy is in many ways.
Well, we mainly
anymore,
have a
but-
services-based economy, so we don't produce very much.
No.
But I mean, on the industrial side, I mean, I presume the green stuff is. I mean, the government is constantly talking about like green industrial policy. Our wind turbine factory closed, so yeah, maybe we don't make that much.
No.
We just stopped using coal.
That's the next step, I think. For
And
us
now
is to-
I think a majority of our energy comes from renewables most of the time. So that's fine. Go sunbathe, feel good, wear suntan lotion, skin cancer. Actually, a depressing story we could have chosen today is skin cancer rates are going up.
Oh no.
But I thought I'd go for solar power instead of that. You can set the mood by doing the news, and I chose solar panel instead of skin cancer. I hope you appreciate that. Banseka, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Do have a fantastic weekend. I hear it's a bank holiday on Monday, but we'll be back here. Enjoy the sun. Come back on Monday. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.